Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 11, where we begin talking about Asian American representations. Just getting ready here to share my screen. And the readings for this week come from two chapters from this book by Ono and Pham, and you can find those on Canvas. So to begin with, there are two keywords that the authors introduce in the chapter about yellow peril. One is the idea of conceptual maps or maps of meaning, which refers to the concepts we already have about a particular group of people based on limited information or experiences we have had. Thus, when we approach or encounter this group or individuals, we are already interpreting them based on this previous limited information. The other concept that they talk about is structural embeddedness, which they define as when some discourse exists across different sectors of society, is reproduced across time, space, and media, and is not easily changed or eliminated. So in this chapter, they talk about this image of yellow peril and how it has existed historically. And here are some of the ideas that are attached to this particular image, that the United States is about to be taken over by enemy Asians, that there's this racist terror of alien cultures, white women are threatened by Asian men, that they're animal-like, unassimilable, and diseased. And you really see some of those elements in this image here that was also in the article. And the article talks about how these images have had an impact on the kinds of policies that are passed or have been passed that impact Asian American communities, like the Chinese Exclusion Act and in the 1800s and the Japanese American internment during World War II. And they also discuss how this same image manifests itself in new versions throughout US history. The reading talks about how this image has appeared from early Hollywood films, where Asian men are depicted as asexual, effeminate, or undesirable, or they're depicted as diabolical, sinister, and evil, as we see in the example the reading talks about, the early film A Broken Blossom, and the first image you see there is from that film, or the Fu Manchu movies, where he is depicted in this sort of diabolical or sinister way, and also how Hollywood has used yellowface, or the use of white actors to play Asian American or Asian characters. And in the discussion of the film, he talks about how even though there is a clear romance between the quote unquote yellow man and the white woman, fears of miscegenation or racial mixture don't allow for the romance to take place. So the best thing that can happen is for the Asian man at the end of the film ends up killing himself, because if he can't be with the white woman has been killed by the white brute in the film. And so he ends up killing himself or sacrificing himself for her, in a way, for her love, or for this sort of unrequited romance. New manifestations of this yellow peril that were discussed in the film include this idea of Asians taking American jobs, and the reading talked about the case of Vincent Chin, Asian American young man who was beaten to death a number of years ago because of this assumption that Asians are the ones that were taking jobs away from Americans, particularly in the auto industry at this time. And so you just see that as one example, right, of this narrative that Asian Americans are taking American jobs away. There is, with this global economy, we hear narratives about the dangers of products that are made in China, as the case of lead found in Chinese toys. There's this idea of this Chinese infiltration into our political system, in our news media, and that's the image that you see here that was discussed in the reading, where during the Clinton campaigning, where he was being supported by a Chinese American individual, they were being talked about as being infiltrated by the Chinese. And so this particular image appears in this cover of this magazine, National Review, in 1997, suggesting that the Clintons and Al Gore were becoming Asianized, right, or infiltrated by the Chinese. And most recently, we've seen this narrative around Asian Americans being diseased and a threat to our health, as we've seen in the ways that Asian Americans have been talked about in relation to COVID, or COVID being described as a Chinese disease. In the section on controlling the yellow peril in the reading, he discusses, or the authors discuss, how these images contribute to conceptual maps that exist about Asian Americans. These images represent what the dominant group believes about Asian Americans, and it's not a representation of how Asian Americans understand themselves. So as the reading explains, these images, as well as the idea of Orientalism, are externalizations of what Europeans or Americans believe about Asian peoples in the East. And these ideas and representations continue to persist because of the limited number of Asian Americans who are in charge of media production. So very similar to when we were talking about Latinx representations in the media. The chapter after that talks specifically about representations of Asian American gender and sexuality, where Asian women are depicted as lotus blossom or Madame Butterfly, images where they're represented as exotic, sexually alluring, sexually available, passive, self-sacrificial, and particularly the Madame Butterfly image presents this idea of the Asian woman always willing to sacrifice herself for her white male lover. Another version or another depiction of Asian women is of the Dragon Lady, which is portrayed as being suspicious, deceitful, and conniving. And there were a number of examples from recent media or recent films that the reading talked about, where you see that kind of image. In terms of Asian American men, they're depicted as villains, undesirable, effeminate, asexual, nerdy, such as like the computer geek or the tech geek, or as martial artists. And the reading also talked about how these images, both of Asian men and women as submissive, are upheld in pornography. So there's a wide range of media in which these kinds of images are portrayed and upheld. And the clip that I include there talks specifically about the representations of Asian American women. Finally, the reading ends with a discussion of the image of Bruce Lee as an example of someone who represents an alternative image of the Asian male. However, in his own experience in Hollywood, he wasn't taken seriously and had to leave to Hong Kong in order to establish himself as a viable and profitable actor in films before he was able to come back and be hired to do films here. However, because he primarily appears as a martial artist in his films, he inadvertently represents another stereotype attached to Asians of being martial artists or knowing Kung Fu or what have you. So these are some of the representations that we've seen historically of Asian Americans in the media and the kind of impact that they have. We'll continue this discussion next week. And so this ends our discussion and lecture for week 11. I hope you guys have a good week, and I'll see you next week. Take care.